Yeah, man, I'm really excited sitting down with Dona Freitas. Donna is an author and a voice, and man, she has got such a resume. She's written over, I want to say around 10 novels or so, 10 books, I should say, because I know there's some nonfiction as well as fiction in there. She's spoken at over a couple hundred universities. I would imagine that's international as well as domestic. She's appeared on NPR's All Things Now. She's contributed to the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. She's just done a lot and has a lot to say, and really excited to be sitting down with her in the context of kind of unpacking and exploring healthy sexuality. Donna, how are you? Good to see you. Thanks for being with us.
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure. And again, we're honored that you took some time to sit down with us. So why don't we start there? It's a really big question. What is your idea of healthy sexuality? And maybe to help be a little bit more specific, like what is it that humans are looking for in their pursuit of sex? I think, there's different contexts, whether we're a single person pursuing sex, a married person pursuing sex, somebody that's in a dating relationship. Can we just start with that big question?
I mean, it's one of the biggest questions of all. So I think it's hard to just give an answer.
Yeah.
I would say that one of the things I tell college students when I talk to them and kids as well is just everyone is different. I don't think there's no such thing as one size fits all healthy sexuality. And I think
Okay.
In my heart of hearts, what I really wish for is that, as kids are growing up and certainly as they become teenagers, that they learn to just ask that question, period. What is healthy sexuality? I think
Yeah.
we tend to raise our kids, or because I think we're often afraid of kids asking that question. And so we don't empower them to ask it. And so then, they enter high school, they get to college, and they've never really given any thought to it. And what I really wish for, what I think we need to be doing with kids and young adults, especially, is getting them to become critical thinkers about sexuality, kind of like we do about everything else. And I've been advocating this for a really long time. I think we're really good at teaching our kids to become critical thinkers about history or certain subjects in school, but we don't necessarily empower them to become critical thinkers about themselves, like just even asking questions like, who am I and why am I here and what do I want, do I know, like things like that. But I think we certainly don't raise them to think about sex in this way, like what do I want from sex, what does healthy sexuality look like? And I think just getting in the habit of asking that question and going on a search for the answer.
Yeah.
I wish that we empowered kids and young adults to do that, but we don't. We tend to be afraid of the question, or we give them a kind of here are the answers. Like we give them sort of a set of answers and tell them to just sort of live those out. But that often doesn't really work. So that's what I wish for. I wish we were teaching our kids to ask the question and really search for the answer.
Yeah, and I didn't do the best job of introducing you in the context. Like a lot of your written work is pointed at youth, children, young adults. And so it's a big answer you just gave. Like, hey, I feel like our kids are boxed in, and I feel like our kids' ideas of their own health is connected to what we say is right and wrong. And instead of giving them permission to explore, make discoveries, be in an open dialogue, the idea of empowering, what does empowering young people look like in your opinion? So you're saying, I just wish we would empower them. Is that, hey, we want to sit down, we want you to feel safe, we respect you? Because I do think one of the pursuits of sexual health, I think our pursuit of sexuality is so tied to our identity, isn't it? Like how I feel about myself has a huge bearing on my being sexually active or being in sexual health.
Mhm.
So what would be empowering towards children look like as parents, maybe as mentors or friends? I don't know.
I think it's often, we think it's gonna be scarier than it really is. Like, I
Yeah,
think a lot of it is often just empowering kids to begin to use language. Like, and what I mean by that is,
sure.
especially in secular contexts, everybody seems to be very afraid of the word ethics in general, or like sexual ethics in particular.
Okay.
And one of the things we don't seem to understand is that we are doing relational ethics all the time. Like you and I are doing that right now. Like
Yeah.
because we're interacting. This
Yeah.
is relational ethics. I'm choosing to be nice in my answers. I'm not yelling at you. Like I'm looking in your eyes. I'm regarding you as a human being. And so we are engaging, because I have certain priorities for my behavior with others. And just like you do too, like you're not yelling at me, at least not so far. Like I'm sure you have certain commitments to treating other people, like how you treat them. And so we are engaging in relational ethics. And kids are engaging in relational ethics all the time, and especially in their friendships, but in the context of their families. And I think one of the things we don't do a good job of is just pointing that out, or like getting our kids to understand, like, oh, like, how, like, you have a certain idea of what it means to be a good friend and how you want to be treated as a friend.
Mm,
And I'm sure your friends do too. And when you're being a bad friend to someone,
mm,
when you're being a good friend. And so our kids know these things,
yeah.
and teenagers know these things. College students know these things. Uh, and they are able to articulate them. If you ask them, they can start articulating, like, oh yes, I know exactly what I think good friendship is and what I think bad friendship is. And suddenly they're articulating a pretty developed sense of relational ethics. But as soon as we shift to the idea of sexual ethics, people tend to
Mm,
like break down and freak out because it feels so much scarier. And um, I think one of the things that's really important for us to do is to just get kids and teens and college students and ourselves, I think, in the habit of understanding the fact that like we are practicing relational ethics all the time, and there's a very short span between relational ethics and sexual ethics. And so I think often from our very developed sense of relational ethics and friendships, and our the way we interact with our family, we can develop a pretty strong sense of sexual ethics too. Like that's a great foundation that we have, and we're doing this all the time, so it's something that's really familiar with us. And so I think we often don't empower kids to make that shift and really start thinking beyond friendship when they get older. Like, okay, well, now I'm getting
yeah.
older. So how do I want to behave with a partner?
Yeah.
And how do I want a partner to treat me?
Yeah.
And, what are my expectations? Or even just getting kids to, and teenagers and college students and all of us to understand that it's totally okay to have expectations
Yeah.
of your partner to be treated in a certain way. It's
Yeah.
totally okay to decide, you know what, I don't like the way you're behaving with me.
Yeah.
So this isn't comfortable with my sense of ethical behavior, and so I'm going to end this. And so I think that's the kind of empowerment I'm talking about. These are very basic tools we all
Yeah.
have, but because we don't use the language,
Yeah.
I think sometimes because we're so afraid of it, we don't actually teach our kids and young adults to use those tools. And I think we often don't know how to use them ourselves, no matter how old we are.
Yeah. And would you say, again, back to the identity piece, like those that maybe whose identity is more intact, it's a more natural process to have a
What do you
sense of
mean more intact?
maybe more developed, maybe their self-worth is in a place of strength, less vulnerable to woe is me and there's a lot wrong with me and I'm a problem. And maybe, yeah, maybe they're okay with loving themselves. That when that identity is in place, there's would you say there's more of a capacity to enjoy sexual relationships with boundaries or a sense of ethic? Like this is what I'm okay with, this is what I'm not okay with.
I think, it's funny because I'm always operating inside and outside of a Christian context. And
Yeah,
so I would say outside of a Christian context, um, when young adults, like, they never talk about boundaries. It's almost like you're not allowed to talk about boundaries anymore.
okay.
And so when you get into a conversation about boundaries and just the idea that, I've been in so many conversations with college students where I'll say something like, right, that you have the right to decide, this is what I want to do, this is what I don't want to do. And students are often like, what? They sort of, like,
Wow.
they've never necessarily thought about, what do I want?
Yeah,
What are my boundaries? Oh, by the way, I can establish boundaries. I can just decide, if I just want to kiss people, that's all I'm going to do for now until I decide otherwise, and that is my right. And so I think empowering young adults to see that they can determine what they want and don't want to do, which
yeah,
may seem obvious to a lot of people but is not in their context, I think can be very powerful. It can be life changing.
yeah,
But I think on the opposite side, I feel like often, in a Christian context, kids have grown up with only boundaries, and often it's like, no, 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 no,
yeah,
no. Like, you
yeah,
can't, you can't, you can't, you can't. And so, just the idea that they can also decide their own boundaries and say, okay, well, kind of
sure.
like, here are the boundaries I've been offered, and I'm gonna start thinking about what I think about those boundaries. Like, where am I in relation to them? Do they make sense to me? And if not, why not? And what do I think my boundaries should be, if not these? Like, sort of being in a position to really think critically about them, and then, push against them, or just be, or realize, oh, I am self-aware enough
Yeah,
to trust myself to make decisions in this sphere that don't look exactly like the ones I've been offered. And I think, that's why I feel like, really, this issue of, becoming a critical thinker about yourself and about sexuality, I think is so important. And I mean that in, like, the Socratic sense. I have a background in philosophy, and so I
mhm,
always sort of think about, the tools that philosophy has given me to be a thinker, in terms of ethics and just relationships. And I really wish that we raised our kids to get into those habits.
yeah. And I love the title of one of the books that you've written, The End of Sex: How Hookup Culture is Leaving a Generation Unhappy, Sexually Unfulfilled, and Confused About Intimacy. Obviously, you wrote a whole book on that, but what are some of the big discoveries or big ideas you're sharing in that book relative to, again, sexual health, identity and wellness, maybe like a current cultural context that we see alive in our generation?
Well, I actually, so that's the second book I wrote about hookup culture. The first, which I think a lot of Christian colleges probably still teach, is called, Sex and the Soul:
Okay.
Juggling Sexuality, Spirituality, Romance, and Religion on America's College Campuses. And,
Okay.
both books are related to a big national study I did about sex on campus.
Okay.
And, it was the study itself was a while ago, but I've been pretty active, until before the pandemic, sort of still in conversation with young adults about, or with college students about that material. But, I mean, basically, when I started asking questions about sex, um, on college campuses, I got an earful about hooking up. And so, I would
Mm,
say hookup culture has been the norm on college campuses for many, many years now. I don't know how many, like
sure.
15, 20 year, going on 20 years. And so
Yeah.
it kind of feels almost passé to talk about it.
Yeah.
I would say the caveat would be that, that's not the case at evangelical Christian colleges. So, CCCU schools, I'm sure you know what that, the Coalition of Christian Colleges and Universities, like schools that fit under that umbrella, are
Okay.
in their own category, and they tend to have, purity culture or abstinence culture. So, so you don't see hookup culture on those campuses, like at all.
Okay.
Not the way you do in at Catholic, private, secular, and public institutions. And
Sure.
so, I would say that related to what I was talking about earlier, I think one of the things that's very clear in the context of hookup culture is students sort of feel like this is just the norm. It's a kind of sexual ethic that they're handed,
Yeah.
as they grow up and they go on campus. Or I would say it's almost like an anti-ethic.
Mm,
And the ethic it prescribes is that, sex is no big deal, it's casual, it's meaningless. And so therefore, you should approach it that way. You should be casual about sex. You should be casual about your partner. And most students, sort of go along with it, but also most of them don't feel great about it. Like it's very rare that you find young men and women enjoying themselves in this context. They often just feel like this is just what we have, and so this is what we have to go along with. And I've written a lot about consent in relation to hookup culture as well, which I think you
okay.
were looking at that book. But I would say that there's a kind of coercive nature to the culture. And in some ways, like when I wrote about it for Sex and the Soul, I wrote about how purity culture and hookup culture are like two sides of the same coin.
Wow.
In both contexts, college students feel like stuck in them. They feel like they're handed this framework for sex that they don't fit into,
Wow.
but they're stuck with it. And so I would say the same thing I found for, purity culture at Christian colleges. Like they're handed this framework that doesn't really make sense for them, but they're stuck with it. And they're all trying to navigate it, and it's kind of a mess. And so so I would say in a weird way, purity culture is comparable to hookup culture. It's just in the sense that it's also coercive and really rigid.
Yeah.
And a lot of students struggle in the context of it.
Yeah, and maybe unpacking that a little bit, like what were some of your discoveries on the more like the looser side of the equation where hookup culture is more the norm? Why were students unhappy? Like generally speaking, students were not satisfied with that. Is it a lack of intimacy? Is it, yeah, I'm sure there's a lot to say there, but what is your kind of nutshell on this is why it's not working? And I want
Because
to do this, I want to do the same for the other side too. I don't want to just talk about what's wrong in secular culture.
I would say that most young men and young women uh, tend to care about their partners. Like they want to care about sex, they want to care about their partners. Just
Okay.
like, I was talking before about how, college students often have these very developed sense of relational ethics, even if they don't use that term. Like they're very committed to their friends. They care deeply about
Yeah.
each other, their teammates, for if they play sports. And so they have really developed senses of commitments to one another and to
Okay.
their studies, to teachers, to their families. Like they're very, like it's really rare that you find someone who's truly a jerk. So, except hookup culture sets them up to be jerks to their partners, for lack of a
Wow.
better way of putting it. And it's not really what they want generally. Like, and they do want to care. So hookup culture teaches you not to care about sex or your partner, and your average student does care about sex, and they care about their partners, or they want to care. And so they're trying to learn to show they don't care instead. And so it just doesn't work for them. And
Wow.
so they end up feeling guilty, bad, it just they don't feel good about themselves generally in
Yeah.
the context of it. So, or
Wow.
they'll try it for a little bit, and they'll sort of try to go along with it and say, "Oh yeah, this is totally great. I get to be casual and not care." But like eventually they really lose steam, and they often feel the reverse, and they kind of have like almost like a hangover from it.
Yeah.
So, so yeah,
That's
I think it's just, like a lot of, if you sort of hand someone a framework, but don't ask them what they actually want, but you're just like, here, this is what you have to live with. It's kind of like, let me decorate your apartment and then make you live in it, but in a style that is not yours. And then, And you're not allowed to move anything. You're not allowed to change the colors. Like you're gonna have to sit on this like leather couch that you don't like or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, but that's kind of what we do with young adults and sex.
And those that are desiring a different paradigm, are they ostracized for choosing a different reality there, or is there almost hope and like, wow, you're talking about something I'm interested in, like you mentioned empowerment earlier, and people were like, what, I could like set boundaries sexually, that's great. Yeah, what did you see, or if any?
I mean, it's not that students are like socially punished or something if they
Yeah.
don't go along with it. It's just more that they often feel very isolated in
Okay.
the context of it. And
Yeah.
because everyone learns to be silent about how they truly feel,
Hmm.
because, and because you're afraid not to conform, or like
Yeah.
you want to be part of what you see as the social scene, you don't speak up. And so I would say that there's a lot of silence around it. And so a lot of students believe I must be the only one who feels this way, when in reality almost everyone feels the same way, but no one is talking about it. And so there's just kind of I have no other choice. I don't see a way out. So I just kind of go along with it. And when I say going along with it, I don't mean that means that they're like hooking up all the time. It's often just that they're sort of in the midst of this, and then they sort of don't actually go out after what they really want, which is often a
Yeah.
relationship or a partner who cares about them. And so, they just kind of are in it and trying to survive while being silent.
Yeah. What sounds like they probably need some examples, huh? Like some people that are doing it differently and maybe experiencing a different level of fulfillment and happiness. And on the other side, within what you're broadly referring to as purity culture, what have you discovered there? Again, there's a dynamic of like, this is what you must do. What are young adults experiencing over there in terms of fulfillment or happiness or lack thereof?
Uh, you know, I mean, I know purity culture, that's like, it's just grabbing a term to sort of apply. I know there's
Sure.
lots of different terms, but that's the easiest one, or you could just say like abstinence only culture, I guess. But
Yeah.
I would say that, they're the students who really thrive in purity culture are the ones who are good at it. So like, kind of like with, the ones who feel like they are like, I've sort of joked in the past about how like the like Olympic virgins, like the ones who are like really, really good at holding out, or who
Yeah.
kind of get engaged by their senior year and manage to get there without having sex, like so they feel really superior. Like I think there's certainly a group of students who feel really superior to everybody else because they're like, look at me, I did this perfectly, no one else has,
Okay.
I can see, like I know. And so I would say
Yeah.
that there's a lot of, there are very few
Yeah.
students or who truly thrive in the context of purity culture.
Yeah.
That isn't to say that it's all bad, or that there aren't good teachings, or
Totally.
or that um there aren't really, positive things, that positive values that students get from it. But I would say that in general, it functions a lot like hookup culture, in the sense that it's this culture that's handed to you,
Yeah.
and if you don't fit it, you're kind of, it's like a real bummer for you. And a lot of the students talked about how it fosters a lot of gossip, especially about women
Mm.
who don't live up to certain ideals.
Yeah.
And so there's it's uneven in terms of expectations for women as opposed to men. And I would say that it's a disaster if you turn out to be an LGBTQIA youth.
Mm.
So it
Yeah.
can be crushing. I would
Sure.
also say it can be crushing if you become one of those students who does become sexually active, and then other people find out that you are.
Yeah.
um, I spoke to students who told me things like, my community threw me into to the trash pile when they found out I was having sex. And so like, I heard students referring to themselves as garbage, you know, like,
Yeah.
because they became sexually active. And so I
Yeah.
think, you know, on either side, you have these, a sort of ethic, I guess, if you want to, or a framework that
Yeah.
you're giving young adults that can be really crushing, to them. And, you know, it's really, I can't find anything really good to say about hookup culture, so I'm not going to. Um, but it's also hard in the context of purity culture, the way it's, sort of been sold to young
Yeah.
adults in the context of Christianity. It's I would say there are certainly young adults who can, thrive in it, but I would say it's often at the expense of others.
Yeah.
So, so looking at these two different cultures over the years, that's what really made me think about, this question of why is it that we try to determine a healthy sexuality for all, as though we can package it and give it to people. And I mean, this goes for marriage too. People are trying to do this all the time. Like, here's how sex should work in marriage.
Yeah.
And then we hand it down, and then everyone who doesn't fit feels awful.
Yeah.
And so, I really wish that we would stop doing that. And instead we would try to think about what are the tools we need to offer people so that they can find their way
Yeah.
in a healthy way.
Yeah.
Because there isn't, you know, this one size fits all sexuality. And then,
Yeah.
you know, how can we, you know, how can we trust people? I think there's often such a lack of trust. We give these people these ready-made packages.
Mm.
I think often with kids, because we don't trust them to truly struggle on their own and to make good decisions.
Mm.
But I think to really empower someone to figure out what healthy sexuality is for them, you also have to trust them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it feels like at the core of all this is like there is a really big identity piece and a human being flourishing, right? An individual experiencing their experience of being a human, like, wow, I feel fulfilled. And to deny our sexuality in that process would be just a huge mistake. So like in maybe that's one of the swings of the pendulum within purity culture. Again, we're generalizing, is like, well, we just don't do it. And then you've got a huge gap. And then on the other side of that pendulum in hookup culture, yeah, we do it, but it doesn't really matter the way you do it or how many times you do it or who you do it with. And yeah, this feels like a really delicate, beautiful, complicated thing that, and I love the bottom line you're drawing of, can we let people be people that are in the middle of a discovery? You know, they're in a process, they're journeying. I do think in the faith culture that's one of our big challenges, huh? It feels like we've somehow feel the responsibility to package things and like to tell people what to think or how to think. And that's disappointing to me because I just don't think that's the human experience. Like for those that are alive, I think people that are alive don't want to be told what to think. But so maybe going there, what kind of tools, and you've offered a very big one already, like, hey, let's just give people an opportunity to discover. And when you're talking about empowering people, I love this big idea of like an ethic. Like we have relational ethics, we can have sexual ethics, and those are almost synonyms, like relational and sexual ethics. Are there other things that come to mind when you think about tools? Because that was a beautiful statement you made. Like if we can just give people tools rather than, okay, here's your package.
I think tools and trust, tools and trust.
Trust, yeah.
Tools, you know, giving people tools is also a way of saying, I trust you. I know that you are gonna, like, you're gonna make mistakes, or but you're also gonna make good decisions. And because you have a good head on
Yeah.
your shoulders, like it's, you know, it's having faith that people
Yeah.
can do this. I mean, it's not like I don't think, it's not like I think people should just stop writing books about sex or stop writing books about marriage, or, we need those, we need those books. We need people to be thinking through these things. We need people to be also, I think, making themselves vulnerable, for others, saying, this is my journey. Here's what I did my best to do. Here's where I failed. Here's where I figured things out. Because I think we need models for how to do things. I think the problem is when we decide that the model is like the answer for everybody. And so like it's not like I'm against structure, like I think like the scaffolding for thinking things through. Like I'm this big fan of, like, one of the things I've always loved about Aristotle, his Nicomachean Ethics, is that it just feels like such a great scaffolding for figuring everything out. And one of my favorite assignments when I've taught when I've taught Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, is to get my students to try to live an ethical day according to Aristotle, because his framework in the Nicomachean Ethics is that, virtue is a habit, just like vice is a habit. So like you have to practice, like to get good at virtue, you have to practice it. And for him, in a lot of ways, ethics is different for everybody. So because, he talks about how everybody should be sort of going for the mean, like we don't want extremes in either end. And so I usually give my students an example of like a virtuous breakfast for Aristotle, it'll be different for everybody, right? Because 2 eggs for me is plenty, but I don't know, maybe like a 400-pound football player, do they get that big? I don't know, would need 5 eggs or something. Like, he just needs more protein because he's 400 pounds and he's sort of, what is that, like 3.5 times my size? I don't know. So, so like virtuous breakfast for him, what the mean for him, the amount of eggs would be different than it is for me. And, just like, I ask my students like, oh, what would it mean to have a virtuous experience at a party for Aristotle? It may not be drinking no beer at all, because that's kind of lame. Like maybe you have 1 beer because you're like 100 pounds, or maybe you're 300 pounds, so you can have 3 beers and be fine. Or, and maybe it's just like enough beer to enjoy the party and be there with your friends and be social. And so I love the fact that it's flexible. It's flexible enough to accommodate, I think, often our desires to figure things out for ourselves, but it gives us scaffolding. It gives us ideas about what works and what doesn't. And it helps us develop a sense of self-critique. Like, oh, when I'm at the party trying to be a virtuous beer drinker, when I start to get a little woozy, like I should be in the habit now of figuring out, like that's when I know to stop or to slow down. And so I think providing those kinds of models and frameworks is really important. But I think it's often hard to find, especially in a Christian context, the kind of ethics that someone like Aristotle is proposing that does have a lot of flexibility. Because I think we often want to be like, this is the way, kind of like the Mandalorian, like this is the way, we can never take off our helmet. I don't know if you watch the Mandalorian. Like there is, we can have no eye contact. So I think we often just give these very rigid structures.
And I think, and with something so, I want to use the word dramatic, like sex, when somebody is making discoveries, and they cross a line and they have sex, and maybe their ethic is, I'm not going to have sex until I'm married, but then I did have sex before marriage. And if their experience from the community is being trashed or let go of or dropped, which obviously doesn't feel like the Christian ethic at all, because the Christian ethic is to love each other. And that's challenging to me, because I would imagine if somebody crosses that line, there's an element of like, they're trying to live, they're trying to make discoveries, they're trying to probably enter some level of fulfillment they weren't previously experiencing. I know for me, my story, not growing up Christian and being sexually active before marriage, yeah, I discovered quite a bit of intimacy in sex. There are things that happened in that period of being sexually active before marriage that were very fulfilling, and then also very unfulfilling because of multiple partners. And so I made a lot of discoveries about what was important to me, and the kind of life I wanted to live going forward. And so, but that is, to me, as a Christian leader, very it's tragic, very saddening that if somebody makes a mistake, now they're trashed, now they're jettisoned, they're left behind. That doesn't feel like Christian community. I didn't ask you a question there. I just made a bunch of statements.
No, I appreciate you sharing your own experience. And I would just say that I think the other thing that makes me sad is how many Christian young adults have talked about how they, like, God rejects them if they have sex. Like they not
Sure.
only lose everything. Like there's this sense like the stakes are that high. Like
Yeah.
we've made the stakes that high.
Yeah.
That if you do this one thing, all is lost. Like God is lost. Like the respect of your entire community is lost. Like you were lost. And I don't think those stakes work for anybody. Like that's because also what that does is that puts people at risk, right? Like one of the things I've talked a lot about when I go to Christian colleges, I've actually, I try, always unsuccessfully, but I've tried to get administrators to understand that, you have this law on the books, like, this policy in the student handbook that says if we find out you had sex, you can get kicked out. But then they
Wow.
all say, oh, but we want the students to come to us and tell us if they're sexually active. We want them to trust us. And I'm like, you
Wow.
can't have it both ways. Like you can't have that policy. You
Yeah.
can't hang that threat over their heads and then also tell them, but if you come to me and you
Yeah.
tell me, I promise you won't get kicked out. So don't have the policy if you want them to trust you. Because they're
Sure.
not going to trust you no matter how many times you tell them to, because you're still hanging it over their heads that, by the way, they might kick you out. They still could kick you out. Or if you go to the wrong person who's not as nice as me, you could get kicked out. And so,
Yeah.
we can't ask people to trust us if we threaten them at the same time. And then the question becomes, what do you want more? Like, do you want people to trust you and do you want them to be in conversation with them? Or do you want to be able to kick them out? Or do you want to retain? And I think it's kind of like I've tried to convince people, but I feel like no one ever believes me. I feel like when I go to Christian colleges, you have an entire student population who takes so seriously the teachings of Christianity, including abstinence, even if they're struggling with it. They still care about it. Like they take it seriously. But at the same time, we're too scared to trust them. We're too scared to trust their struggle and their efforts. And so we keep this policy on the books. And I think there's this fear, if we take it away, we're not going to be a Christian college anymore. And to me, that sounds like the one at Catholic colleges that drives me nuts, which is we can't allow condoms near our campus or we're not a Catholic school. And one of the things I've tried to tell people is, and bishops love to pick fights about condoms, sometimes public fights about condoms on campus. And one of the things I say is like, that sends the message that to be Catholic is to not have condoms in our vicinity. And I'm like, what an impoverished vision of Catholicism. Like Catholicism is so much more than condoms. And yet we have somehow decided to make it all about condoms. Yeah. And I feel like this is similar in Christian colleges. Like we've got to have this, we can kick you out if you've had sex on the books, like this policy, or we're not a real Christian college. And I think that that's a mistake. I think it teaches the community that to be Christian is to not be having sex.
Yeah.
At least not till you're married, and that's it. Like that's sort of the number one goal. And I don't think that should be the number one thing that we're thinking about when we're teenagers and college students, that to be a good Christian is to not have sex. I think it's
Yeah,
about a lot more than that.
yeah, man, that's such an important point, because I think that the innate drive, this God-given desire, I mean, it's connected to our wellness and our health and our sense of self. And I mean, I think the conversation is, what is it that humanity is pursuing or missing when there isn't sexual health, you know? And so I love the point you're making. If it's just about whether, you know, you shouldn't be having sex until you're married, I'm like, yeah, that doesn't feel like the conversation. The conversation is, we're hungry, we're alive, we're searching, we're making discoveries. Probably more on the trust element for me, like what you've discovered and learned about trust. Because I think, I mean, I'm a parent. My children are, you know, they're not the oldest, but my youngest is in university, and so she's very much coming of age, and my youngest is in high school still. And I think my greatest joy as a father is actually seeing my kids discover themselves, you know, and get in touch with what they love, and dream dreams and pursue those dreams, whatever. So what about the trust element? Like, if we could be a community that facilitates growth and isn't just like putting people in boxes and saying, this is the way you must think. Anything that you'd want to add to that? Because I think that's such a big piece of the puzzle.
I think, you know, a lot of this is about messiness. You know, being a human is messy, and there's beauty in mess. You know,
Yeah,
there's beauty in imperfection, and there's discovery, and there's creativity, and
yeah.
sometimes there's tragedy, like you can't avoid it. But you know,
Mm,
this is all very messy. Like our journeys are messy in every sense. You know, we're not perfect human beings, but I think we have to learn to be okay with mess. That's what trust is about. Like
yeah,
you want to, this is why I always feel like I want to tell parents, even though I know it's scary, like the best thing you can do is to learn to trust your kids on this, because the more you trust them, the more empowered they'll be, and the more empowered they are, the more they're able to make choices. The kids who
wow,
don't make choices, the kids who can't make choices, and therefore just let culture be a wave that, you know, like a tidal wave that just like sweeps them up, are
wow,
the ones that are not empowered. So
wow.
the best thing you can do is sexually empower your kids,
Yeah,
because then when they show up at like University of Ohio or something, you know, like some sort of giant like secular institution,
yeah,
they're like, I am a decision maker about my sexuality. Like,
yeah.
this is mine to decide about. This is mine to judge and think about. And I see all these people around me doing all kinds of things. Now, what do I think of the things they're doing? Do I like them? Do I not like them? Like, this is what I want for all young adults. Like, I want them to see themselves as decision makers,
Nice.
you know, who need to make choices about sexuality. That they get to look at everything that's going on, including stuff like their church is telling them, you know, their parents are telling them, what they see happening all around them with like their peers.
Yeah,
And then they sit there and they're just like, does this feel right to me? Does this not feel right to me? Like, okay, I'm gonna try this. I'm just gonna try this. If I don't like it, I'm not gonna do it again. Like,
yeah,
because it's my decision to make. And
yeah,
so I feel like this is what we should want for kids. Like, we want them to feel really strong and confident, and also to understand that, like, I'm going to make mistakes, or like, I've got to be like, my sexual ethic can't be rigid. It's got to be flexible enough to evolve with me as I get older, because
yeah,
I'm going to grow and change, and life is going to be different. And so it can't, like, I can't just like pretend like it's going to be this really solid thing.
yeah.
And so I think that's the best thing we can do for each other, but certainly the best thing that we can do for our kids. And I understand that's a scary ask, but I feel like when you see the kids who are disempowered,
Mm,
you'd be much more inclined to try to empower your kids in this way, to turn them
yeah.
into decision makers and critical thinkers about this aspect of who they are. because you're going to realize they're going to be so much stronger and more fulfilled, and they're going to
Yeah,
make so much better decisions.
that's great. I love it. Yeah, I mean, it's human nature. If you're being raised, someone's telling you this is what you must do. I mean, as somebody comes of age, they're going to rebel against that. So creating a sense of you're empowered and I trust you, and you're gonna make good decisions and you have discoveries to make. Yeah, I love that. This is so important. Um, well, anything that I haven't moved us towards that's on your mind that you'd like to articulate? And again, it's a big topic. Sexual health. Sexual health is like, well, we could talk for hours probably. Um,
I would say we haven't talked about consent as a topic.
yeah.
I think one of the things that has been most like, so as I grew up Catholic,
Okay.
and one of the things that has been so interesting to me is how open conversations about sex are in Christian communities as opposed to Catholic ones. In Catholic communities, people are kind of terrified by sex.
Okay.
And so I've been so pleasantly surprised at the openness and the ways
Yeah.
that, even though I am Catholic, um, Christian communities have been so inviting of me to come and speak and to talk about my research, and I've just found the conversations I've had to be so wonderful in many
Mhm.
ways, regardless of the critiques that I might make.
Sure.
But I would say the one conversation that I have really wished to be able to have in the context of Christian college communities that people seem to be really terrified of is the conversation about consent and sexual assaults. It's
Okay.
kind of amazing to me how that conversation can still be so silenced
Wow.
when there's such vibrant conversations happening about sex, even if they're generally about abstinence, they're still happening.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to figure out how can Christian communities that do make such an effort to have these conversations, why are they still so afraid of this particular one?
Yeah. Do you have any hunches on that? Because that's shocking to me.
Um, I don't know. I mean, I think because sometimes I think because there is this business, there's like a policy on the book that says if you have
Mm,
sex, you could get kicked out, even though, of
I see.
course, being sexually assaulted is not having sex.
Yeah.
But I think there's still this like a short circuit there, or like we
Yeah.
don't know how to, and I think often it's been a while because all sort of lecture visits and things have stopped since COVID, but I've definitely had conversations with young women, and there are certainly, I think, there's a lot of, sometimes this shows up in the news where young women, there's kind of if they come forward with an accusation of sexual assault, there's sort of a period where there has to be an investigation to make sure that they're not, like that they're, because sex can get you kicked out. There's sort of like this
Yeah.
weird space of, we have to make sure that you didn't just go and have sex before we can treat this as a sexual assault. There's almost like this uncertainty
Okay.
there. And, I think there's a sort of a weird short circuit around this topic, and like almost like a fear
Yeah.
of it. And it's obviously a very difficult topic, because of the topic. It's a tragic topic, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about it or we shouldn't make space for that conversation. And I know that in Christian communities, there's been a lot of talk about abuse,
Yeah.
sexual abuse, that's something that's happening a lot because there's unfortunately so much abuse in the context of, so much sexual abuse in the context of Christian communities. But I think the topic, when it comes to young adults and college students, is still something that we're very afraid to touch.
And would you say that it's less fearful in a secular context, like the conversation's just natural and it flows over there?
I would say that it's mandated
Okay.
Not always in a way, like often in ways that I find very unproductive. Like we've
Yeah.
tried to sort of legislate it. So we'll come up with policies that are going to prevent it or something, or we're going to come up with policies about exactly how things have to happen, or it's sexual assault. And I think there's a fear of the messiness of sexuality, or just like people are afraid of lawsuits and scandals.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense of, or there's this belief that if we can just come up with the right laws and policies, we can somehow prevent scandal and problems. And that's, I think, its own problem. Or we can somehow come up with like tutorials for how to prevent sexual assault and sexual harassment, like
Yeah.
like human resources kinds of tutorials, which are mostly they're just they're sort of, again, providing some sort of like rigid framework about how things are supposed to happen and not happen, and that doesn't work either.
Yeah.
So I mean, I would say it's mandated, so people are talking about it. And
Okay.
I don't know that Christian colleges or Christian communities, for that matter, are talking about it in the way that I wish people were. Like, I don't know, does Bethel talk about this stuff?
I think sexual exploitation is something that's being approached. I think consent specifically, and why is it a problem?
Mm-hmm.
Why are people being taken advantage of sexually? Like what's your nutshell there? Like why is it rampant? You talked about hookup culture being so coercive. Is there something to say to that? I mean, I know there's a lot to say to that, but what would you say to that? Why is this a problem?
I would say, I'm sure, I don't know what the statistics are at Christian colleges, for example, but I'm sure they're pretty similar to what they are in the context of hookup culture.
Yeah.
I think sexual assault happens when, well, depends on all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But I think situations of sexual assault can happen when communication is verboten or breaks down.
Okay.
I would say, like, on it at its most basic level. Then there are situations where there are people who are simply violent,
Yeah.
and decide they're going to assault someone.
Yeah.
But I think so many situations of sexual assault on college campus have to do with factors that are related to the culture that people are in, when there's a lack of communication or discouragement of communication, period. Like people are trying not to communicate, or they're and I would say, when I first did my research on college campuses, one of the things that was really striking to me was how many sexual assaults were reported to me by students, not as sexual assaults, but as hooks or experiences of sex that they had, which were clear to me that were assaults. Like there was a lack of consent, but the students didn't know to name that. And that the same thing went for Christian colleges. So I had young women report sexual assaults to me in the course of interviews.
Yeah.
And so I don't think one community has fewer instances than another.
Yeah.
But I think often we're afraid to talk about consent in context because it implies sexual activity in some way. And so because we don't want young adults to be sexually active, we decide we don't need to talk to them about it.
Wow.
And I think that has to change.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I don't know if it's part of when you guys talk about sexual health in your community, when you're talking to young adults and talking about sexual health, if you're also talking about consent and what that means.
Yeah, I notice it more in the secular context that I work in and less in the faith context. So I think what you're bringing up is, well, it's all valuable, but this is definitely a point that I'm noting, and I want to kind of do some exploration in our context, our culture.
I would just say as a last thing on this issue that to go back to what I said earlier about ethics, like relational ethics and sexual ethics, I think, if we're raising our kids and young adults to be thinking about relational ethics, which is thinking about, how do I want to be treated and how do I want to treat other people? And we know how we want to be treated because we're in our bodies, and we know people who've treated us wonderfully, and we've also known people who've been jerks, to us over the years, like people who've been jerks at school, or and I mean this like in a friendship way, people who just
Yeah.
haven't been nice, or like kids at schools who are, who are just not nice. And so, and when we've been not nice, we've all had moments when we're not nice to other people. So like we know what that is. And we've been developing that sense since we were young. And I think this is part of, like, I wish that our conversations about consent started there.
Yeah. Great.
This is like, we can develop an ethic of consent, of sexual consent from that place, because we know what it means to have certain expectations of how others treat us, whether that's in a friendship setting or in a sexual setting.
Yeah.
But I think when we start talking about sexual consent, we often, it's like we short circuit again, and it becomes this very legalistic conversation as though we're no longer human beings thinking about these things.
Yeah.
And we're always human beings, like, thinking about these things. And like, I think we don't start with the basics. Like, just like I said, like, you and I are practicing relational ethics right now. Like, we're also practicing consent.
Yeah.
You ask me a question, I decide to answer it. You told me before the interview started if there's something I didn't want to talk about, or that I could tell you, like, I'm sorry, I don't want to talk about this. And
Yep.
we set some, we're still talking. I know that, like, I feel like if I need to go for some reason, I can be like, listen, I'm done now, and I like, I think I need to go. Like, we would negotiate all of that. And
Yeah.
this is consent we're engaging in. We're engaging in acts of consent.
It's good.
And I think so, like, in a lot of ways, that conversation is just so basic. Like, we're practicing consent when we go to the store,
Yeah.
like, even in, like, I feel like, like, in the context of COVID, all of our little rituals around consent have broken down, especially toward the beginning, when we were, like, afraid to, like, touch, like, we were afraid to take money from someone or take someone's credit card, right? Because they might have
Yeah.
COVID on it. With, like, those kinds of things, which are often, like, we're consenting without thinking about it. We hand over a credit card, or we take someone's credit card, and we don't worry about it. But now we're like, do I want to put gloves on to take your credit card? So, like, all of these things have forced us to really think about what do we want to consent to and not,
Wow.
just in basic everyday life.
Yeah.
And so I think it helps us see how common consensual action and behavior is in our lives. And it's the same thing in sexual consent. We just get really scared of it.
Yeah.
Because like, the stakes change so much for us, and we've made the stakes change so much. And so, I wish that we would let ourselves begin with those very basic, safe, like, very, like, easy circumstances in which we can talk about these topics, because they're still relevant and they still make us think about all of these issues, which can turn really high stakes but don't have to. We just make them that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. I love it. I love these thoughts. I'm so thankful you're sharing them with us. This conversation has been very valuable. And I love the perspective you're sharing, and kind of the place you're coming from, as we're, again, talking generally about sexual health and wellness, and really good stuff. Where would people, if they're looking to maybe do a deeper dive or follow you or find more of your stuff? I mentioned earlier you've written quite a few books, so people can find, literally, you can just go put Dona Freitas in and you're going to see her. She's got a website. But you should say that. Like, where would people follow you or find you? Sorry.
You can go to donafreitas.com.
Okay.
I newly I guess it's been almost a year
Yeah.
I started an Instagram account last year as an experiment, and I've actually really enjoyed it.
Okay.
And sort of like bookstagrammy, like a lot of authors are on Instagram, but a lot of readers contact me on Instagram, and I've just really enjoyed. I've been surprised by how much I've enjoyed it.
Nice.
So that's a place to reach me. I'm donafreitas.writer
Okay.
on Instagram, and then you can just email me to donafreitas@gmail.com.
Great. Yeah, that's perfect. I so appreciate what you're doing. Thank you for what you're engaging with in our culture. I think this is so valuable. And it's been a pleasure talking with you, Donna. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, it's been
And
so nice to talk to you too. I've really enjoyed it.
oh, that's good to hear. Great. So with that, I'm going to say adios, goodbye. It's been good sitting down, and we are going to continue this journey around sexual health and healthy sexuality. Donna, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.